One, we have everyone muted, but we wanted to welcome you to the webinar this afternoon. Um, as promised, we are going to be bringing you some webinars about every 2 months to just kind of keep everybody abreast of what's going on and to offer you that technical assistance that we said we would. We know with our funding, we were fortunate enough this year to have some 100% funding from USDA. That is not always promised, and as we can see, you guys use it up really fast. I'm talking to the education navigators now, and we know that you are always looking for other sources out there. Some of our colleges are fortunate enough to have Project Skill Up. Some have State Employees Credit Union. Others of you I know use foundation funds and some of your local scholarships. However, Michael Carter up at AB Tech has been very successful at obtaining other funding streams. And so we wanted Michael to be able to give this webinar for you today to talk about the other funding streams that he has been able to obtain. So at this point, I want to introduce Michael Carter. Michael, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and begin.
Sure. Thanks so much, Teresa. So what we're going to be doing today, so my name is Michael. I'm an education navigator over at AB Tech in Buncombe County. And we were one of the first programs to get started. So they asked me to do a presentation / webinar on some of our funding habits. So what we're going to do today is kind of just walk through what our journey has been as far as finding funding. So far, we've been able to secure a little over 80,000 through grants and things like that to fund our project, and we're on track if the year goes well to secure an additional 150,000. So I'm gonna tell you guys a little bit about my journey and what we've done so far to get there. So the first thing we're gonna do is kind of just talk about the agenda for today, some ground rules, things like that, just so we're all on the same page. So we're going to do an overview of fundraising culture, and basically what that looks like is what does it look like to fund an E&T program and be diverse in the funding that you're trying to tap for E&T programming. Then we're going to talk about specific E&T funding strategies, and then we're going to have a brief conversation about program management and funding, just some things that you can do, navigators can do as program managers to be strategic with the funding that they do have. And then we're going to talk about pitfalls and partners. So it's things that, I wish I would have known / things that we did wrong, maybe that you guys can learn from and be informed from. And then we're going to have a conversation about identifying partners because, we don't do this work alone and we're much more successful when we work together. And then we'll end with questions and next steps. And we have like a little question activity in case you guys don't have questions or something like that. And then some next steps and some follow-up because I do want to be able to provide a little bit of support after this in the form of different things. So before we get into that agenda, I do want to go through some ground rules. So conversation versus presentation. I think the best presentations are things that are conversational, that are participatory. Unfortunately, because of some technical issues, I can't see if you guys write or type anything. I can't see that or look at that at all. So unfortunately, that's a drawback. So at the end of the presentation, just write out a question or what you're thinking as the presentation is going on. And Teresa will maybe read those things out to me or highlight those things because I can't see that. Or once the presentation's over, maybe I can take a look at that then. The next thing is, this is one framework of many. We're going to talk about what our program did. Our program is called STEP, the Skills Training Employment Program. We're going to talk about what we did and what our journey was. Just because that's what we did doesn't mean that's necessarily going to work specifically for you. And that's 100% okay. So I just want to let you know we're talking about some of the tools that you choose what works for you, take what works for you, and what doesn't, you can leave here. That's totally fine. And, oops, let's try this. Oh, there we go, housekeeping. If you can't hear me, write me. Obviously, I had that before I knew I couldn't see anything that was written on the presentation. But please just type things out. Taritha's checking that out. Carmen's looking at that. And if there's any technical issues, or you can't hear something, or you can't see something that's supposed to be presented, they will do their best to fix that or let me know. There's going to be a follow-up email with this Prezi, and then links and some attachments and some samples and things like that. So if I mention anything and I go, oh, this was our funding plan, I might say, oh, that'll be coming up in an email, because there'll be an email after this to kind of braid together the things that we're talking about. Because I always think that having some follow-up is always a really good idea. So those are to start things off-handedly. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started, and kind of the first thing we're going to touch on is building a funding culture. Try to put the fun in funding. All right, let's take a look. So the essentials, one of the things I kind of wanted to touch on briefly, but it's kind of one of the fundamental things I think I've learned from funding through EMT is building institutional buy-in and kind of finding your champions. And so what that looks like is we've been really, really fortunate. So I report directly to our Vice President of Workforce and Economic Development, and she's been our champion of our program. And what that looks like is she's been someone that's been able to go to bat as far as budgeting, keeping an eye out for resource allocations within the college or redirected resources as far as budgeting. And when we're talking about building those institutional champions, we're not just talking about the vice president of the college. We're also talking about the administration that is your county partner, or the folks that are on the upper levels of your county partner as well. Because as you know, we're dealing with large scale organizations. There's always money being moved around. So I think that's something that we've learned. If we tap the right folks and engage the right folks and having a conversation with us to be thinking about us and putting the EMT program at the forefront when they're having funding conversations, that has been exceptionally helpful. That also looks like not just even administrators, but, student services staff as well. If they know about an upcoming scholarship that's happening or something like that, that's something to think about too. Set clear budget connected goals. So for us, what that looks like is we're taking a serious look on a regular basis at our budget, and we're looking at where the holes are in our budget, and we're anticipating based on what we're spending, what we're going to need. Because you can't develop or create a funding plan or generate a funding stream unless you know what you need and what your target goal is. Because if we don't know where to start, we don't know where we finish, right? So, and then the next thing was manage the workload. So I know, as navigators, funding is not our primary responsibility. Our primary responsibility is serving students and connecting folks who are receiving food assistance to access to education and training options and employment. That's why we get up in the morning. But I do think it's important to make funding a priority, because we can't do those great things unless we have those resources. So now just to touch into the I wish we knew part, in talking about touching on those resources, I think it's a big thing, especially for navigators specifically, not to assume that someone else is going to handle the funds. I think, when I first started, I had the assumption of, the money's just going to come, it's just going to be there. And I think that's the hard part, and that's the tricky part for a lot of folks. I think handling the funds is something that you should be proactively participating in. Of course, you're going to be developing partners, and you're not going to be doing it alone, hopefully. But I think it's important for the folks that are actually doing the work with clients and with potential students and, current students, to be the folks that are talking about or a part of the conversations around how much money we need, when we need that money, where we're going to go to get that money. Because you guys know on the ground, what work is getting done. You're best able to tell that story. So I encourage you, to assume responsibility for it, but also recognize that you don't have to assume responsibility for it alone. The next thing is that if there's no funding plan, then there are no funds. So I think, that kind of goes back to the, someone else might handle it. I don't have to worry about that. I think when you choose to make it something that's a priority for you, when you choose to make it a part of your role, I think another big piece of it is having a plan and having a plan written out specifically on what you're going to do, where you're going to place your energy, what that's going to look like. And later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about, how we get into the nitty gritty of that and what it looks like to develop a funding plan. But I do think it's important that should be always be your first step. It shouldn't be, an afterthought, or going after a certain, money stream, whatever, without having a plan. A plan is always the very first thing you do. And then link your fund usage to your funding plan. And this is pretty important too. So we know the busiest time of the year for navigators is the beginning of the semester. So you know that you're going to spend a lot more funds in the beginning of the semester because more classes are starting in the beginning of the semester. Even in Con Ed, a lot of classes start towards the beginning of the semester. So think about, when you're putting in for grants or you're putting in for any kind of funding stream, when that money is going to be released to you, and line that up with when you think you're going to need that money the most. So the next section we're going to talk about is the rules. So we're going to talk about the 3 rules of E&T funding. So these are kind of the 3 things that I think about often when we're talking about generating funds and funding planning and things like that. So the first one is the 50-50 rule, and that's pretty much, I think at this point, everybody should know that, but any non-federal funds are 50-50 reimbursable. So that includes local funds, private funds, and state funds. So, if you get a grant, that's local/private funds. If you have a donor that comes and says, I want to donate this amount of money to the college specifically earmarked for E&T, that's a private fund. So those are things that you can get reimbursed for, which is really, really helpful. And then state funds too. So, when your leaders are looking at your state allocation, and there might be space and room to move money around there, that's also something that's going to be reimbursable as well. The second rule I wanted to touch on was mission creep. So that's a term for folks that pursue funding options that don't align with their work, and they're pursuing funding options because they need money. That's when I say paper chase. I mean the pursuit of funding versus the pursuit of funding for your mission or for your goals. So that looks like joining partnerships that add and create work versus joining and creating partnerships that fund the work you already do. So just thinking really intentionally about where you're pursuing your dollars and whether the pursuit of your dollars matches with the mission of E&T and the mission of your specific E&T program. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about mission creep. The next thing I wanted to touch on was salaries and supportive funds. So that's large sums focused on generalized service area for maximum flexibility. So what that looks like is working with folks for funding on 2 specific areas. That's paying for you and paying for your work and paying for what you do, and paying for the supportive funds to make sure that the clients you work with can engage in programming at the college. And so if we're breaking that down, that's tuition, that's books, that's materials, that's all those things we need to be able to fund and be thinking about funding. So that's kind of where I choose to devote a lot of the energy when I'm writing grants or when I'm thinking about entering into a partnership or a contract with another organization for services. I'm thinking about how can they support salaries and how can they support supportive services that I offer in our program. So can folks hear me? I just got a text that Shanika couldn't hear me. Can folks hear me? Everybody here? Okay, Ashley Graham can. All right, cool. I'm just gonna keep going then. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about program management, some fast facts and tips so that you guys have a good solid basis. And so when we're talking about program management, what we're talking about is the day-to-day things that we do as education navigators and how we can kind of insert the funding culture into those daily tasks and responsibilities. So the first thing I want to touch on is conserving/leveraging funds. So if we're really great stewards of our funds, then we need to go for less funds because we're great stewards of those funds. So I think some of the things that we've done in our program to implement great stewardship starts with scholarship funds. So what funds currently exist? What funds are you currently using? So that looks like the SECU funds, the State Employees Credit Union funds. We try to partner and use that scholarship or take advantage of that. And as Teresa was saying earlier, what local scholarships that your college works with, what can you take advantage of? Because remember, if we go back to one of our rules of EMT funding, those scholarships that are already present and already exist at your school are fundable. Are 50-50 reimbursable. So you can draw down on that and kind of get some more funding coming in, which is super important. We also have, I don't know if other folks have this, so I thought it could be useful to share. We have a drop policy for our clients. And so what that means is if a client signs up for a course with us and then they drop that course before the 10% date without notifying us, we don't enroll that client in another course until a 3-month waiting period has ended. And we tell our clients that upfront before we even put somebody into a class. Like we have an orientation, we tell folks about that rule. And if they come back to us after that 3 months and then they drop a class again after the 10% date, then we no longer give that particular student access to tuition-based funds, scholarship-based funds. And basically, the reason why we did that is because when we first started, we were paying for people to take classes, and then the person would drop that class midway through and then not tell us. So dropping a class is totally okay. You know what I mean? There are a lot of things going on, especially with our client population. There are a lot of things that might pop up. Dropping is totally okay. But not communicating with us after you drop the class is kind of where the disconnect happens. So, we had situations where we were spending funds for very expensive classes, but then clients, weren't completing those courses. And so, we weren't getting the value out of the money we were putting into that. So after we implemented that drop rule, we actually saw a decrease in the number of clients that dropped classes. So that kind of helped us preserve and save money. So that was a really cool policy that I think was really helpful and useful for us. So I think it's a good way of conserving funds. That way we're being great stewards of that money. We also do a monthly spending review on my team. And what that means is I pull all the cost authorization forms, and that's the forms you use whenever we spend money. I pull all those forms for a month, and we review and look over those expenses that have been sent. And I think it's just really helpful for us because we are constantly looking at what we're spending. And it's kind of like, when you're paying attention to your bank account, you notice a little bit more things that are happening, what's going in, what's going out, and you spend better, you spend wiser when you're returning to that on a routine basis. So I do think that's a strategy that's helped us to be able to conserve funds as well. And then last but not least, as I was saying earlier and kind of talking about earlier, you have to plan ahead. You know what I mean? Like that's a huge thing. Being able to plan ahead, being able to think ahead as far as when you're going to be spending money, what time of the year you spend money more, what classes are some of the most expensive classes that you expect to be able to fill. Because when we're thinking ahead on those things and planning ahead on those things, then we can pull resources to ensure that we can meet that demand. Because, the worst thing that we can have happen is, we have clients that are interested in taking classes and we don't have the money to put those folks through those classes. That's really difficult. That's really hard. And, I've had to have that conversation with someone before and it was difficult. And I promised myself I wouldn't have to have that conversation again because I would do a lot of planning on my end. I would try to be more as proactive as possible on my end. So those are just some tips. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail on some other areas of that. In the area I kind of want to jump into is telling your story. So create a narrative of your work. So if you're pursuing funding opportunities every day, you meet with clients, you talk with clients, you share with clients about the work that y'all do. You have to be able to do the exact same thing with funders. Whether you're talking about local, state, private funders, whoever you're going to for money, you're going to have to tell that story to that person. And we want to make sure that you guys have all the tools you need to be able to tell that story. So, 2 things. Success stories. Develop a template. That is huge. It is really difficult to kind of get a client's success story if you don't really have a form for them to fill out because every single person is different. The conversation you might have with that client about their success story could go many, many different ways if you don't have a go-to form or a go-to process. So I strongly, strongly encourage you guys to develop a template for that. Grab them when you can. As you know, our clients, as education navigators know, our clients are very transitory. So especially after they finish a class and go out there and get a job, they disappear on us, rightfully so, because we've helped them and we served our purpose. But I think it's important, when you are interacting with that client and you have them on the phone, grab that story then, because you don't know when you're going to be able to contact them. And then last but not least, success stories are not just for the quarterly report. I think success stories are a really, really powerful tool in any grant that you're going to write, in any conversation you might have with a private donor, in any relationship building meeting you're having with a partner. To be able to tell the story of your success is going to be important. And then the second piece I kind of wanted to touch on was the signature approach. So the best part I think about the ENT program in North Carolina is that our programs are different, and there's a lot of freedom and space to individualize them. And so because that is available, I think it's really important for navigators to be actively thinking about how they tell their story and how they support their community and what niche they serve in the community. And you can do that through kind of developing an elevator speech, and developing something that you share with clients and potential partners that succinctly talks about what you do in the community. Because if you can't talk about it in an effective way, it's not going to translate well in other mediums, whether that's written or in conversation. So, when we talk about STEP, our elevator speech kind of focuses on how STEP is a partnership between Buncombe County and AB Tech to support individuals who are receiving food assistance with access to education and training, and a focus on living wage employment. See, so that's like our little spiel. And in Asheville, in Buncombe County, in our area, we have a really, really strong coalition for living wages in our area. So I kind of connected our stories to something I know is unique to our region. That's a focus in our region, living wages. So I think just knowing what's special about your community and knowing what niche your particular program serves in that community and being able to communicate that in a really succinct way can be super helpful. All right. So another big thing about getting funding is having people know what your program is and what you do. So highlight visible programming in your community. So if you are doing an outreach event, let folks know that you're doing that outreach event. Connect on your college's social media. Let folks know that you're out there, you're in the community, you're staying engaged. When you have an amazing, awesome success story, don't be afraid to contact local media. When an article comes out about your program or your services, that is a new funding tool that you have. That's a new visibility tool you can use when you're applying for grants. You attach that article, to whatever grant application you're submitting. It's a really, really good idea. And, that's something that's low effort, but high yield, which is a really, really good formula for fundraising, especially when fundraising isn't your primary responsibility. Take community engagement seriously. I think this is a big piece too. So in Asheville, we did a block party. Every year we do block parties in public housing. And we bring in over 40 different service providers and lots of different activities and things like that. And we've made a lot of partnerships and a lot of deals through those events and through the visibility we've gotten at those events. So our goal, is to get more participants in our program through those events, but it also raises our profile, which helps us when we apply for grants. Because people say, oh, I know about that. I went to that event. I know what you guys do in the community. I've seen that. So visibility is super important. And work with partners to lighten the load, and running communications and things like that can be really difficult and really cumbersome. So I encourage folks to take advantage of their own community relations and marketing department if your college has that, or a public engagement team if your county partner has that. Use some of the professionals that are going to be in your county or college network to help you push that message. You don't have to do it by yourself. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is supportive services and saving money on supportive services, like couponing supportive services. So a couple quick things I want to talk about is use what is already available. So before you're using, this is kind of how we've been approaching it. Before we used our E&T funds the system office gave us, we wanted to tap into sources that we knew were already going to be available. So we're fortunate enough that our college has an emergency fund, and that's used to help and assist students who are needing some support. So we make very heavy use of the emergency fund. And our county also is fortunate enough to have a general assistance fund that we sometimes have access to help and support clients as well. And that's, doing things that are going to support clients with finishing and completing courses and gaining employment. So that looks like bill pay for a client if a utility bill is coming late. That looks like rental assistance for clients. That looks like car repair, which is a huge thing for our clients and our client population. So those things can become very, very expensive, but some of those things can be reimbursable. So it really just depends on, what is reimbursable and what isn't reimbursable according to the E&T toolkit. But some of those expenses can be, and if they're not, and you're using county funds or you're using local funds to pull from that, that's better than using the funds that you already have allocated to the program. The next thing I want to talk about is like faith and social service organizations. And I just want to tell a story real quick. We work with an organization called Women's Song, and they're basically like a group of older women who want to support and nurture the next generation of women, and they're singers, and they have a emergency assistance fund that they use. So you fill out and complete an application, and up to $600 can be designated for a client for a new start. And I had no idea that that program existed at all until we got out into the community and we started working with folks. So now we have clients who have those big ticket items. Like, for example, we had a client that needed a computer to take an online class. We are able to partner with that organization, fill out an application, and get that client the resource that they need. So I think it's really important for us as navigators to be creative and work outside of the set budget line items that we have to find the resources we need for our clients. That being said, while we're doing that, we need to maintain a 50-50 mindset. And what I mean by that is if we're spending any kind of funds on transportation for folks, we're pulling resources for transportation in any type of way, because we know that's an allowable expense, we're trying our best to figure out how we can get 50-50 on that. So with any partnership that we're, starting, or any resource or line item or creating to support clients, we're constantly asking ourselves, is this 50-50 reimbursable? Is this helping the long-term longevity of our program by starting and creating this partnership? So I'm just thinking, when you're thinking about branching out and developing a menu of supportive services for your clients, I think it's a really, really good idea to always have that 50-50 mindset. So the next thing we're going to talk about is E&T funding strategies. So we're going to put the emphasis and the focus on developing a funding plan and kind of what that looks like. So a couple of things with that. I am going to, in an email that you guys are going to get after this, I'm going to give you a sample funding plan. It's our funding plan we did. So you guys can kind of take a look at that and kind of review it and steal any ideas that you need to. But the basic elements of a funding plan, of our funding plan rather, are an abstract, and mission statement, programmatic and funding goals, funding strategies, narrative of past successes and accomplishments, success stories, an overview of program structure and partners, and an action timeline. So those are all the different things that are in our funding plan. Some of those are self-explanatory. Others of those kind of need a little bit of extra context. So with programmatic and funding goals, the way we did that is we had a conversation with everybody on our team. So I have myself and another navigator and a job coach on my team. So all three of us got together and we said, what are the gaps? What are the things we know we're missing? And we also brought in our budget person who does our budget in the finance office. And we said, what are the gaps on our budget? What are the things that we need? If we know we want to do or plan a special project in the future to help and assist folks, then how are we planning our budget and planning our funding goals around that? And what we did was we planned 1 year in advance. So we knew we were going to go after grants in a certain year, 1 year in advance. and we lined up and created a schedule that resonated with what our plans were. So I think that's really, really important. We developed a menu of our funding strategies, and we're going to talk in depth about our different funding strategies and our different funding methods. So I'm going to kind of gloss over that. But then we also created a narrative of past successes and accomplishments and success stories. So those two things are different. So a success story is a conversation about a client that did a really great job that's connected to your program. So the emphasis is on the client. A narrative of past successes and accomplishments is totally different. It's like a success story that's focused on your program, the overarching goals of your program, the overarching successes of your program. So I'll give you an example. When we did the narrative of our past successes, we put an emphasis on the fact that before AB Tech joined the ENT contract, the average wage rate for participants was $8.35 an hour. After we joined the contract a year or so later, that average wage rate raised to $11.37 an hour. So that's a huge, I think anyway, like that's a big increase in the average wage of workers that are engaging in this program. So that's a success that is on the program level. It's a narrative that's on that has to do with the overarching impact we're creating on the community. So I think both pieces of that are really, really important when you're developing a funding plan. You have to talk about how you are affecting the community on the macro and meso level, while having those success stories that resonate on that micro, interpersonal, individualized level. All right, so when developing a plan, the more feedback, the better. Budget the time in your schedule to develop a plan and pull resources from the county and the college in the plan development. The strength, and I can't emphasize this enough, the strength of your partnerships is really, really important in developing this plan, because you want to be able to leverage and use the resources at the county level, as well as leverage and use the resources at the college level, and get a clear understanding of what's available and what isn't available. And that's what it looks like by getting that feedback. So if you're developing that plan, I would strongly suggest you having your county partner look that over, and then also having your college look that over as well. Either your supervisor or the folks, if you're the foundation, folks that work in your foundation, because they might be able to offer some feedback or support that, or things you didn't think of to improve your plan. The key factor here is you have to develop it yourself, but don't refine it alone. All right, so now we're going to kind of get into the nitty gritty of some of the funding strategies we've either used already or plan to use in the future. So the first one I wanted to talk about is grant writing. And you guys will get a copy of this presentation, this Prezi, and you guys will get a copy of the links that are in this right now too. But the one link below there is a link on grant writing basics. Because I thought about it and I said, I think it's better if you guys read up on grant writing basics and me go over grant writing basics inside this presentation. So I encourage you to click that link, look at that. But one of the main things that I want to put an emphasis on as far as the grant writing piece is to be very, very intentional about the grants that you go after. Earlier, we talked a little bit about mission creep and going after money just to be going after it or because it's available versus going after money because it fits into your plan and because it fits into your goals. So I think that's something to really, really be cognizant of in grant writing. And so for each of these, I'm going to give an example of what we've done. So we're lucky enough to have a local foundation here in our county, and we applied for what we call a People in Need grant. And that process took a little over 3 months, but we were able to, after we wrote the grant and established some goals, to get $20,000 allocated to staff and staff salaries and supportive services for clients. And that, it took, I would say, 8 to 9 hours of work to assemble the grant plan and do all that kind of stuff. But we ended up with $20,000, which was, for us anyway, it was a huge amount. So I do think that grant writing is going to be one of your best tools. And when you're crafting and creating a funding plan, that should be the crown jewel of the funding plan should be some grant writing. Because the way the ENT is structured, it's a program that lends itself to effective grant writing, I believe, pretty easily. But there are some easier ways to get money too. And one of those is corporate sponsorship. So the link below there is for Wells Fargo's corporate responsibility grant, which is unique to North Carolina, or they do ones like throughout the states, but they have one that's just focused in North Carolina. So that's pretty huge because then the competition is extremely limited because you're only going up against folks that are in our state, which is super helpful. So we did a corporate responsibility grant with Wells Fargo, and that process took 2 hours. Literally, it just took 2 hours after we had already written our first grant. So it wasn't a lot of time that we put into that. And we were able to get $10,000 from that organization. And the turnaround on that was pretty quick. So I encourage you guys to look at some of these larger scale corporations that offer these corporate responsibility grants because they can be significant amounts of money that we have to put a low amount of effort into in order to get. So what we're talking about there is low effort, high yield, and that one of those corporate grants is the best bet for that in particular. And we also have things like Walmart. Walmart also does very similar grants to Wells Fargo, and Target as well. Those are some other places you can take a look at. So I strongly encourage you to kind of take advantage of that or look into that as well. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was partnership grants. So a partnership grant, how I'm defining it, is you are not the lead person on the grant, like someone else has got the grant and they need like a partner, or they need someone else that's going to help administer what they say they're going to do in the grant. And that has been really helpful for us. We were lucky enough to partner with a local organization in our county, MHO, which stands for Mountain Housing Opportunities. They got a $50,000 grant from the Asheville Merchants Association. And the grant was focused on employment and training. And so they came to us and they said, you guys are an employment and training program affiliated with the college. You know, would you like to partner with us on this grant? And we had a couple of weeks of conversation on what that would look like, what we would design, how we would support it. But it was super useful to us because we were able to use that money for, guess what? Staff salaries and supportive services. And so that was a significant amount of money that went in to being able to serve our folks. And I think one of my lessons from partnerships is to be really intentional and pay attention to the details surrounding the logistics of the partnership, who's going to handle what, who's responsible for what, especially reporting. And so what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to attach the grant that we wrote to participate with MHO in this Asheville Merchants Association grant. So y'all can take a look at that. And it's a really good outline for like how you do program development as far as partnering and how you act as a partner with other folks who may be the leads on larger scale grants. So I do encourage you again to try to pursue that if that is an option. Your local workforce board might be a great place to start if you're looking for folks that want to partner with you guys on that. So I think like, and everybody, you know, that has an ENT program has a workforce board that they can partner with. So I strongly encourage you to start there when you're looking at that. But just be mindful of mission creep again, like what works for your organization, what works for your schedule, what works for what you're doing, and what doesn't work. Be cognizant of that. So the next thing I wanted to touch on was foundation and institutional funds. And what I mean by that is some colleges have a foundation that raises money for the college and scholarships and things like that. Other colleges don't. If you do have a foundation, I strongly encourage you to make friends, like very good friends with people in your foundation, because those are the folks that can write grants for you. Those are the folks that can talk to donors at the college for you. Those are the folks that can introduce you to community organizations that are pursuing donors. Those are the folks that can give you tips and suggestions on how to edit your grant policies or how to engage folks that might be potential donors. So there is just a wealth of information that can come from your foundation. So I strongly encourage you to try to partner with those folks. We were able to partner with our foundation to ask the foundation board for $5,000 in funding. And one of the best parts about that foundation funding was that it was unrestricted. And so what that means is I could use that for staff salaries if something pops up, or I can use that for supportive services. And being able to have the choice when we're pursuing funds is super, super, super important. And so that's why the next two we're going to talk about are also opportunities for unrestricted funding. And what I mean by unrestricted is you can use it for whatever you want. Restricted funding is usually tied to a grant, and that means you have to use it for a specific purpose outlined in your grant proposal. So that's the difference between restricted and unrestricted funds. So event-based programming, this is another one that is low effort, high yield. And so I'm sure some of you guys have gone to a restaurant or an ice cream shop and said, oh, hey, today is Community Partner Day. 5% of the revenue we raise today is going to go to this community organization. So we have not been able to use this particular method just yet because we're working in partnership with our foundation and they do that too. But for folks that don't have a foundation that they can go to at their school or at their college, I think this is one of the best ways to get access to unrestricted funds. So, I think a big piece of this is partnering with a local business, preferably a local business that has already hired someone from your program. So I think that's pretty important, but partnering with them to get access to those revenue nights or those special spending nights, and then using either your marketing people or your own social media pages to promote that specific night so they get great business. So there's a little bit of effort involved in that, but it's a high yield. You can get somewhere from $600,000, $700,000 from one night, and making that kind of money in one night is super, super useful for our program. And then what that looks like is they cut a check to the college, and then they specify on the check that it's going to go to the E&T program. And that's how you kind of create that revenue stream. And then last but not least, one I want to talk about is employer-sponsored engagement. And what that looks like is it's really cool. This is one of my favorite ones that we haven't been able to jump on as much yet, but we're trying to. So we have a partnership with one of the larger employers in our area, our hospital system, where they come visit our EHRS class, which is the Electronic Health Record Specialist course. So they visit that course and they guarantee interviews to anyone that finishes that course to work at the hospital. So we're really, really proud of that partnership. So what we want to do is we want to take our lead from the folks over at Rowan Community College in their North Carolina Manufacturing Institute to have that large-scale employer sponsor that class. And what it means for an employer to sponsor a class means that they pay all the tuition and associated fees for that class. And that's 50-50 reimbursable money right there. So, all your clients are getting the class paid for, so you don't have to spend funds to put them in the class. You still get to count the outcomes. And then you get to claim 50-50 on the money that the employer has provided in order to structure the class. And then I always suggest from a navigator perspective to put an interview guarantee in there too to that class. So that helps with the enrollment for the class and things like that. So those are just some of the strategies that I might touch on or that I might use when we're talking about funding and what funding looks like for folks. Okay, and now we're going to go to, there we go. We're going to go to potential pitfalls and partnerships. So we've kind of talked about already some strategies, how to build the culture. So now I kind of want to share some of the lessons that we've learned in our funding journey in hopes that they can be something that is supportive and useful to you. So lessons learned in fundraising. Work with the end in mind. So this is something that we really should have done a better job at when we first started. So we would write grants, and we would, say, here are the outcomes that we're going to have for these grants. And then we would write 2 or 3 grants, and there wouldn't be a syncing of the outcomes and the measurable goals. Because when you write a grant, you get to tell them, how you're going to do what you're going to do and how you're going to measure it. So we would write grants depending on what the grant said and come up with all these different outcomes And then we had to track those outcomes for our reporting. And it became really, really cumbersome to be able, for me anyway, to track all these different outcomes for different grants. So what I think is the best practice now is if you're going after multiple grants, keep the outcomes that you're going to present for these different providers uniform. That way you only have to run one report. And I would also suggest tying it to the quarterly report that we have to do. So you only have to do one report when you're reaching out and communicating with these different grant providers. Because having to do different things based on different specifications just eats up more and more of your time. And I know as navigators, time isn't something that's always on our side. So just being really, really intentional about what the reporting requirements are going to be for a grant and making a decision on whether you're going to pursue that grant or not based on how much of a time commitment that reporting is going to be. Because when you're spending time reporting and looking at numbers, you're not spending time with clients and doing the work that we need to be doing to have the successes we have in the community. So just be really cognizant of how much of that time you're going to have to be spending. That's super important. The next thing is establish clear lines of communication and clear lines of work, like what can and can't you do. So, I had a lot of ideas when I first started around funding. And I realized when I got deeper into the process that maybe some of those ideas might not be possible. And I got that because I started doing them and someone say, oh, wait, whoa, you can't do this. And here's the reason why you can't do that. So I think running the funding plan you have past the higher ups is going to be a really, really important thing. That way, one, you're looping in your champions into what you're doing and what work is being done to secure funding and how they might be able to help you. But then two, also, you're not wasting time in initiatives that, someone's going to hire up, say, oh, no, we can't do that or we can't do this. That's valuable time that we need to be, spending with clients. But in that same vein, I want to say this, get creative and push back. So we did, like me specifically, I experienced some pushback from some of my supervisors on some of the funding things I wanted to do, as far as because of how those funding initiatives aligned with other things that were going on at the college, things like that. So, they said, oh, well, Michael, you can't do this, you can't do that. So then I wouldn't necessarily take no for an answer, but I would push back and I'd be like, okay, if I can't do that, what can I do? What are some suggestions that you have for, how I can secure this funding if not through this way? I think, when we hear a no, sometimes we just shut down. And I think we need to start thinking of the no as a continuing of the conversation. And we need to be the people pushing and driving that conversation forward. So I do think that's a really big thing, like asking what the alternative is if I can't do this in my fundraising. So that's something to be thinking about, something to have on your mind. So next I want to talk about rural area funding. So I know we have some navigators that work in rural spaces and rural areas. And Buncombe County is a populous county, so I wouldn't necessarily count us as, rural, but we're not like super urban either. We're somewhere in the middle. But we're very lucky to have a lot of resources around us. But some counties that have ENT programs don't have that. So in the email I'm going to send you guys, I'm going to include a document on rural funding strategies for nonprofits. So I think that's something to really seriously take a look at if you are in a rural county. But I do want to touch on some of the things surrounding how to get funding in rural areas. So one thing that I learned was identifying the community leaders, whether that's faith groups, social organizations, or wealthy individuals that can lead the charge on fundraising. Who can be your community-based champion? Who can be the people, and I'm talking about, this is the woman that knows everybody at her local church and is, the captain of the fundraising opportunities in her local church. Connect with that person that's in your social network. Tell them the story of what you're doing in that rural community and recruit to be an advocate for your program, to be someone that can host an event, to be someone that can, review a grant that you're writing to the church, or, be someone that can introduce you to someone that is looking to make a charitable donation. So identify those community leaders, those natural leaders who are going to be able to connect with you. Another thing I want to say is get political. So what are the local leaders in your community doing to fight brain drain and create opportunity? So a big issue, especially in rural counties in North Carolina, is, the county is shrinking. People are leaving, especially young people, and they're leaving for jobs and they're leaving for opportunity. So a lot of, the county leaders, we're talking about county commissioners, county council people, whatever, their focus is, how do we fight that brain drain? Highlight and, present your ENT program as an answer to that. And then don't be afraid to ask those folks for funding allocations and have those conversations. So I encourage you, of course, talk to your supervisor about this, have this conversation with them. If they feel like they want to be the person to do that, then, give them the tools, educate them on your program, and ask them to do that for you. But if they say, no, I don't want to do that, ask the why behind why they don't want to do that. Like, engage them on that. Have them participate in that conversation. Because remember, we're not taking no for an answer. We're being creative, and we're saying, if not that, then what? So I do encourage you to take a look at that. Because of our interaction with county commissioners and stuff in our county, we're looking at a $50,000 grant that we might not have had before because we're talking to county folks and having those conversations. So I think that that's a huge, huge thing to not be scared to do. Sometimes it might be difficult to explain what an employment and training program is. So sometimes you can frame it to community members that you run a scholarship program. And people know and get that a lot easier than like explaining all of like what ENT is and all that kind of stuff. So if you frame it as, we're a scholarship program for our local county and we're looking for funds to help send people to school, that's a very, very easy communication. That's an easy tell. We don't have to get into a lot of logistics and things like that. So I encourage you to kind of to feed off that and kind of think about how you can do a narrative around that. And then last but not least, if you are in a rural area, target regional/rural development grants. So, if your county is a really small area, is there any way that you can join up with the next county over to go after a larger grant together? There are special grants specifically for folks that are in rural communities. So I do encourage folks to kind of take a serious look at what grants might be available in North Carolina for your particular rural community. The Sisters of Mercy, they do some great stuff in rural counties. So check that out, look at that. But yeah, that's something to think about as well. Like what special grants, special opportunities available because you are in a rural area. Because I know it can be very limiting sometimes, especially for our rural education navigators, to kind of figure out how they're going to generate funding. So I hope some of those suggestions have helped. Oh, there we go. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is partner identification. And when we're talking about partner identification, what we're kind of focusing on is the folks that can help us do the work that we need to do. Folks who can help us as far as writing grants, can help us as far as taking a look at budgets, taking a look at proposed budgets, taking a look at gaps in our budget. Because like I said earlier, we don't do this alone. This is not something that we do alone. So who are internal partners? So when we're talking about internal partners, we're talking about folks that are college staff. So of course, I talked about foundation staff. I talked about community relations and marketing, senior budget controlling staff. Those are folks that are looking at or have influence over the budget. That's super important to be able to take advantage of. I hear that 100%. But also, how we engage these folks. So I think a big piece of how we engage these folks is having direct face-to-face conversations and saying, hey, like, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to see how you're doing, things like that. And repeated touches to these folks. It's not just stopping at the conversation. We're continuing the conversation. We're continuing to engage these folks on a regular basis, even if initially they're not the most helpful. We're still continuing to have those conversations. We cannot give up on developing internal partners, and we cannot give up on developing external partners either. So when we're talking about external partners, we're talking about county budget staff, of course, other training providers, social service organizations, and workforce boards. Be careful about the workforce boards piece because a lot of workforce boards receive funding from the federal government through WIOA. And that is not something that we can kind of engage in as far as WIOA funding or using WIOA or federal funds again to support folks in our ENT program because that would be what we call supplanting funds. So you couldn't use WIOA funds to pay for tuition for folks in your program unless you get WIOA to handle that entire responsibility. Then it would be 50-50 reimbursable. which is, the lot of reason why we're doing this is to develop 50/50 reimbursable funding streams. So then I guess the last piece of this is really an emphasis on the more or better partnerships that you build, the less work for you and the more time you can spend with clients. So please, 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 like, try to have an emphasis on that. Oh, okay. So then last but not least, the pitfalls. So like I like to call this slide all the things that I did wrong. So I think one of the main things that I wish I knew beforehand, or a lesson that I hope I can impart upon folks today, is preparing for the worst and the best possible scenarios. And what that means is planning for growth and planning for contraction. So when we first started our A&T program, it was very, very small. We only had 15, 20 clients for the first, 2 months. But then we exploded after that. And we didn't really anticipate, getting such an influx of clients. We did enrollments for about 50 clients in a 2-month period. And it was just me. It was just one person. So I didn't really plan for growth in the best way when I first started out. And then I learned that lesson, then I started to plan for growth. And what I mean by that is saying, hey, if we had an influx of clients, where would the money come to serve those folks? What would that look like? And then on the flip side of that, preparing and planning for the worst. If there's a contraction, if for some reason, I think a common scenario has been running out of the money that the system office has given us. So how do we pay for tuition? How do we pay for materials? How do we pay for support services? Because that money's gone. So kind of having a conversation about that and kind of walking towards or leaning into that worst case scenario and trying to figure out what we can do to kind of support that. And a lot of that is using some of the strategies that we've already talked about and kind of weaving those things together to come up with an individualized plan. But we can't do that unless we're thinking ahead and we're assuming that the best possible scenario is going to work out, and we're also assuming the worst possible scenario is going to work out. So that's something to think about, something to engage in, something to turn around your brain. We've already talked about this, inconsistencies in grant goals and outcomes across multiple grants. So for that, what we're thinking about or what we're cognizant of there is we want to be mindful that our grant outcomes match across the different grants that we're offering, and also match our overarching goals for the year. So when we're coming up with our funding plan, we're coming up with our aspirations for the year, making sure when we're writing down a grant matches that. That's super important. Chasing money rather than mission. So, we were really active in the community, and people would come to us and say, I have, this small grant for $10,000 if you guys run this program. And we realized, oh, wow, we really need that money. We should definitely do it. But then we realized how much energy are we taking away from clients by developing this program or leading into this new way of doing things and learning how to do that instead of focusing on our main mission, which is to educate and train participants and then get them connected to jobs. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of creep away from your mission in order to pursue funding. And, I said that before, and I'll say it again, that's one of the main things to watch out for, and a question to consistently and constantly be asking yourself. Does this relate to my mission? Does this funding strategy support our mission and what we're trying to do? And then last but not least, use a calendar/drive. So when you're filling out these grant documents, if you write a grant, keep that grant on file. Use the information that you used in one grant in another grant, because then that cuts down on the amount of time that you have to spend writing. And then using a calendar, there are a lot of due dates when we're talking about funding and building partnerships and things like that. Keeping a calendar and putting on your calendar when those due dates are. Because it is one of the worst feelings in the world to know that, I might have missed a grant opportunity because I forgot when the deadline was. So just being organized and keeping those things centralized in order to be able to best take advantage of funding opportunities as they arise. And we're going to move on to the next slide. There we go. And then the next thing we're going to touch on, because we're pretty much done. That's the main things that I wanted to kind of have a conversation about and touch on with you guys. I wanted to know if there were any questions, and if there weren't questions, then there's other things that we can do to kind of engage. and kind of have a conversation. But if you guys, do have questions, I'd love to hear those. Because I think the best work that we do gets done when we are honestly and authentically talking about what our struggles are, so that we can share information and share resources and work together in the best way possible.
Hey, Michael, this is Margaret. Can I ask a question real quick?
Oh, yes, please, Margaret.
So can you just go back? You mentioned something, I didn't catch all of it, about having employers pay and then doing 50-50. Can you just run over that one again for me, just so I make sure I'm understanding what the suggestion is?
Oh, yeah, cool. All right, yeah, and I apologize if I talk fast. I'm from New York
No, you're good.
originally, so I go a mile a minute sometimes as far as talking. But what I was talking about is they have a really great model at Rowan Community College where they partner with employers, specific employers, a coalition of employers they develop, to pay the costs of a specific course. So for them, it's industrial maintenance. And what they do is the employers donate an amount of money to that specific college, and they designate it in the donation for that specific purpose. It goes into the E&T program. The E&T program uses those funds, they don't have an E&T program, but their program rather. So our program, when we do it, we'll do that. We'll use those funds to pay for and support the folks that are participating in that class. And then we claim 50-50 on that money. So two things happen there. Students they're put into courses, and their course fees paid for and covered. We don't have to use resources that we already have to cover those courses. And then two, we get to claim 50-50 on those funds. Did I explain that well? Did you get it?
You did. What I was just wanting to make sure I wasn't hearing was that employers that were offsetting the cost of instruction and getting 50-50 reimbursement on that, because that gets a more complicated conversation.
No, I'm talking about
what you're talking about
us.
is student scholarship effectively.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, that's all I need. I just want to make sure I was hearing it correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So any other questions from folks? Anything pop up for folks? Please don't be shy. I'm sure if you have a question, that's something that someone else is thinking through or thinking about and might be able to benefit from.
Michael, and for anyone that has questions, you can type them in the chat if you're on the computer, and we can read them off to Michael. If you're on the phone, you have to press *6 to unmute yourself to ask a question. And yeah, so if we have any questions, you all can go ahead and pose those now.
Hi, Michael. This is Jennifer Bowen at Gaston College. I did have a question.
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned, and I just want to make it clear about the WIOA 50-50 fund.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I had a student that we sponsored first semester. WIOA is sponsoring second semester,
mm-hmm.
and the program runs through summer. Would we be able to go 50-50 on her spring payment through WIOA or no?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Can you say that one more time? So it sounds like what you're saying is, yeah, go ahead.
She was sponsored through E&T during her first semester.
Yes.
Second semester WIOA, we were able to get her in WIOA. So WIOA picked up her tuition and books and fees. And they will also sponsor her in the summer, and she'll be completed with the program.
Yes.
Are we able to 50-50 on that WIOA funds? I wasn't clear on that. Okay.
No, unfortunately you're not, because with 50-50, it's the funds that you are spending, like your E&T program is spending. So if you're not spending those funds, you can't draw 50-50 down on that. And also, WIOA is federal funds, and you can't draw 50-50. Yeah.
Okay, I misunderstood. I was thinking you said that, and I thought that didn't quite make sense. So I just wanted to get clarification on that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Yeah. And what I'm talking about with WIOA and workforce boards and stuff like that is like workforce boards primarily, like they distribute money through WIOA, but they also have local initiatives like that are unique to their specific workforce boards. So if your local workforce board has some of those things, then those things are eligible for 50/50 drawdown if you partner with them to make some of those things happen. So an example of that was kind of like our partnership with Mountain Housing Opportunities. They gave us $50,000 through the Asheville Merchants Association, and we used that $50,000 to do their training. And we made it an HRD class, and we put the emphasis on what we were giving our clients. So we got to draw 50/50 down on all of that. So like that was kind of like a partnership model. So that's kind of what I would say would be a good idea to do as far as partners and things like that. All right. If no one else has questions, I did just have a couple quick things for folks. Like if there were strategies that you guys were using to gain funding that I didn't talk about today, I'd love to hear those because I'd love to take this as a learning opportunity for myself as well. So if anyone has any strategies that they'd like to share that they didn't necessarily talk about during this webinar, I'd love to hear those. Oh, come on now, guys. We can't be that shy, can we? Anything?
I think, Michael, at this juncture, some are new enough that they just may not be in that space yet. So that was one of the reasons we really were excited about you presenting this, because you've been in doing it a little bit longer, and hopefully have given people some ideas to go home and think about and start considering what they might be able to do to leverage resources and expand their ENT program outside of the seed funds that they get through the grant, right? So the grant is, kind of look at that as your seed money, and then kind of the conversations that you were having today and where that was going as, how do you expand? How do you create space for more resources, more support for students, and those sorts of things? So I don't know that they're shy. I think that they may just be new enough in that if you do this again next year, they'll all have some of their own best practices and ideas.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that completely. Well, thank you guys so much. There's one last slide on the presentation, and it's just next steps. I don't know if you guys want to put that back up so we can see it real quick. It's super short. And just like what the focus is of that last slide is, hold on, I can pull it up on my computer too, so I can just tell you guys. So there is going to be a follow-up email, like directly after this webinar, and it's going to have links and document examples. So you guys are going to get a sample funding plan, a sample grant, some links to different articles about fundraising. One is fundraising in a rural area. One is all the basics of grant writing, things like that. So I encourage you to use that if you can. I also encourage you guys to take advantage of or build out your own funding plan. I think that's a really, really good idea, because if we don't plan, then we plan to fail. And then last but not least, I know it can be a really, really difficult thing trying to figure out funding. It can also be really stressful, but I would encourage folks to not give up on that process. I think that's really important. It can be really easy to become demoralized, and I think it's really important to never give up in that process, because the reason why we do it is because we work with clients and we want to see our clients be successful. And working on funding is one of the pieces that we use to help our clients be successful. And then on that this isn't the last slide, but I can't move it, unfortunately. But the last slide on this also has my contact information. Oh, there it is. There we go. Oh, okay. But yeah, it has my contact information and my email, as well as my phone number and things like that. My email is Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L. He is in Paul, Carter, C-A-R-T-E-R, at abtech.edu. There it is. And then my phone office number is also up there as well. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you guys so much for spending 2 hours out of your day going through this with me. I really, really appreciate it, and I hope that it was helpful to others.
Well, Michael, this is Taretha. It was very helpful, and we did get a comment from Ashley Graham, and Ashley was just letting you know how beneficial it was, and we have some other thank yous coming in for you. And again, this was some
that's so nice. Thanks, guys.
great
Appreciate
information that you shared. Any of you want to hear Michael again? We actually are presenting on FNS ENT at the SETA conference that's going to be in Asheville, March the 3rd through the 6th. We're presenting on that Wednesday. Of course, they have us in the last slot. It's 3:45 to 5 o'clock. But if you're in Asheville and if you're attending that conference, please feel free to stop by. We're going to have Michael and someone from his NC Works Career Center. It'll be myself and Margaret and Nicola Allen from the DHHS and Mary Moore. So like I said, please go to that. As we promised, we want to try to have these webinars at least every couple of months. So the next one we're planning is probably going to be on April 17th. And it's going to be on processes. And we want this to be like a dialogue since we don't have, since we won't have a chance to meet face to face. Hopefully we'll have some travel money in for the navigators by April, so maybe we can have a face-to-face meeting sometime in the spring. Again, we want to thank Michael, and if you guys have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to send an email to me or to Carmen, or like we said, to Michael. And again, Michael, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Anytime.
Okay, everybody take care and have a great rest of the week.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.